Well, I guess I should say welcome back to the look that I used to use when I first started this video portion of my blogging. I think it's been 2 years ago. I used to do a lot of my blog's entries right after a workout, and I looked pretty disheveled and sweat-worthy. And it's been a while since I've done a blog entry with that same look. So I figured I'd better get back into my usual form and show up more like I used to when I first got things rolling with the Agile CMMI video entries. But that's really not important. What I wanted to talk about today is the dilemma that an organization has when preparing for an appraisal, and the process is truly part of the fabric of the operation. Specifically, obviously, as this is the Agile CMMI blog, I'm talking about preparing for a CMMI appraisal. And I'm usually thinking of operations that are very lean and agile, and that they actually will have a truly challenging time to get their operation appraised with the kind of evidence that we need for an appraisal, such that as it is, it's a requirement that we look at actual tangible artifacts of an appraisal, of an operation in an appraisal. And what do we do when it's so much part of the fabric of the operation that it becomes hard to see and point your finger to and point your finger on? Well, obviously, at least it is to me, that is not an easy task. So the thing that I help clients do, and if you're working with a consultant or an appraiser to do this, this is what I encourage you to do, is to invest a lot of time, or at least enough time, which probably more than what you might otherwise invest in a traditional environment, to actually understand what the operations context is, even more so than you would in a normal appraisal with a traditional approach. Now, every lead appraiser is really supposed to invest in understanding what the context is, to understand the process, so that when they see evidence, they are able to interpret the evidence and whether or not it is indicative of doing CMMI practices. But the real challenge when the process is truly in depth and deeply ingrained in the operation is that frequently it's really hard for the operation to, on their own, come up with what those processes are or what the artifacts of the processes would look like. And that takes a lot of creativity. It takes a lot of being able to think outside the box. I hate using that term, but it's really the best term. It takes a lot of being able to put yourself in a different perspective as an appraiser, as an organization, to be able to find what would be the tangible outcome of performing these practices. Typically it's much more work in advance of the appraisal, but then of course the appraisal will go much more smoothly. It is well worth the time and the investment to have that level of contextual understanding of how the process works and what are the tangible outputs. You may find them in unusual places. You may find them in unusual time sequence of when things might otherwise happen. When it's so ingrained, it's going to take a bit more energy to come up with what actually shows up. How are the practices being performed? Because when you don't have something so obvious as a specific document or specific outcome that a process calls for, and the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, then it's going to take a lot more energy to come up with tangible results. Now, I have to point out that some operations rely on nothing but verbal communication, and then there's the product. Those are the toughest situations, but then we have to look back and be objective about it and be intellectually honest about it, is that if the only means of communication is verbal, and then there's the product, how is that going to be improved when there are problems later down the road? I'm not saying that everything needs to be documented or that everything needs to be a document. What I am saying is that there needs to be some form of deliberate attempt to work in a certain way, and that is captured and communicated, because you yourselves are probably going to wish you had that kind of information down the road when problems that you didn't catch during testing of some sort were not found, but they're found later, or issues or things that need to change. It's very hard to improve. Remember, CMMI is not a proof that you know what you're doing. It's proof that you know how to improve what you're doing. Unfortunately, you may not know anything about what you're doing, and you can prove that you're doing improvements activities with no benefit. That's a completely separate discussion. But remember, even if you can't get a CMMI maturity level, doesn't mean you don't do great work. And the flip side is, even if you are getting a maturity level, doesn't mean you do great work. But the point is that it's not saying anything about your operation in terms of how great it is when you can't get a maturity level. However, maturity levels require that there is some kind of tangible description or some tangible outcome or output of improving how you work. And if there's no tangible output of things that we can improve, then maturity levels are going to be very, very hard to achieve. So you have to think about, is it worth it to be able to demonstrate for our own posterity's sake that we can improve these things, or that we know where to look for improvements? Because without the tangible, you can't really know where and when things went wrong. And that's what CMMI appraisals rely on. They need the tangible thing, because that helps us understand where things are going well and where things are not going well. And so, but the point to this particular entry is that when it's very ingrained as a part of your operation, how things get done and the processes, the things that become tangible become less obvious. And if you're not working with an appraiser or a consultant that can help you find out what those tangible, less obvious things are, it's going to be very painful. So invest the time up front. You'll be thankful later. Good luck.